Knowledge doesn't disappear entirely when civilizations collapse. It goes underground, preserved by those who understand its value and fear its loss. After the flood, after the severing, fragments of Anunnaki knowledge survived through carefully maintained traditions that would later be called mystery schools. These weren't religious organizations in the modern sense. They were preservation networks, maintaining teachings across generations when mainstream society had forgotten or been forbidden from understanding them. Egypt established the most famous schools at Heliopolis and Dendera. Initiates studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and metaphysics. Subjects that Egyptian priests claimed originated from the Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked among humans. This wasn't poetic mythology. It was their historical claim about knowledge sources. The schools used initiation rituals and gradual revelation deliberately, not to create mystique, but to protect knowledge from misuse and ensure it passed only to those prepared to handle it responsibly. You couldn't just learn the advanced material. You had to demonstrate understanding of foundational concepts and commitment to preservation. Pythagoras didn't discover his theorem through mathematical experimentation. He traveled to Egypt and was initiated into mystery schools that taught him knowledge they explicitly claimed came from before the flood. The Egyptian priests showed him tablets, geometric proofs, astronomical calculations that predated Greek civilization by thousands of years. What we call the Pythagorean theorem was inheritance, not innovation. His brotherhood in Greece became another preservation network, maintaining mathematical and astronomical knowledge while presenting it as philosophical discovery. The secrecy wasn't about elitism. It was about survival. Knowledge that challenged accepted narratives had to be protected from institutions that would suppress it. Babylonian magi followed similar patterns, maintaining astronomical knowledge and predictive systems based on Sumerian tablets they treated as prophecies from the Anunnaki. They weren't fortune tellers. They were archivists preserving calculations about celestial cycles, planetary movement, and long-term patterns that required knowledge of mechanics their society officially no longer possessed. What these schools preserved wasn't just information, but context. They maintained the understanding that this knowledge came from external teachers, not human discovery, that it was taught, not developed, that it represented fragments of a complete system that had been deliberately transferred, then deliberately withdrawn. The Library of Alexandria attempted something different, collecting these scattered traditions openly, bringing mystery school knowledge into a central repository where it could be studied systematically. For a time, it worked. Scholars from across the ancient world contributed texts, compared traditions, recognized patterns suggesting common sources. Then it burned. Multiple times, actually, over several centuries. Each time, the most controversial materials, texts describing pre-flood civilizations, Anunnaki interactions, advanced knowledge systems that shouldn't exist, those were the sections that disappeared most completely. What survived were sanitized versions, acceptable histories, comfortable narratives. But the mystery schools continued. They adapted, went deeper underground, became more selective. They couldn't prevent the library's destruction, but they could ensure knowledge survived through their own preservation networks. Later, secret societies, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, Hermetic orders, all claim lineage to these ancient schools and possession of lost knowledge from before the flood. Mainstream history dismisses these claims as invented tradition, groups creating mystical pedigrees to seem important. But examine their symbols, and the Sumerian connections become obvious. The all-seeing eye appears in Sumerian iconography, representing Anunnaki surveillance or oversight. The compass and square are tools associated with Anunnaki building techniques in tablets describing construction projects. The serpent, particularly intertwined serpents, traces directly to Enki's symbol and appears throughout Sumerian medical contexts. These weren't random selections. They were preserved symbols, carrying meaning that the societies themselves sometimes no longer fully understood. Like linguistic fossils, the imagery remained even as the complete context fragmented. The societies functioned as institutional memory for knowledge that couldn't be openly taught. Members gained access to texts, diagrams, and teachings not available through conventional education. Some understood the historical claims behind the material. Others treated it as philosophical metaphor. But the preservation continued regardless of whether individual members grasped the full implications. What looks like mysticism to outsiders was often practical knowledge preservation, teaching geometry through ritual, astronomy through symbolic ceremony, mathematics through initiatory stages. These methods ensured the knowledge persisted even when the reasons for its importance were forgotten. The mystery schools weren't inventing secrets. They were maintaining them, passing down fragments of what had been complete systems, preserving what they could of teachings that official institutions had reclassified as mythology. The knowledge survived, though scattered and partially understood. Enough to hint at what had been lost. Enough to suggest that before the flood, before the severing, humanity had possessed understanding that took millennia to partially recover, and enough to preserve the claim that this knowledge hadn't been discovered by humans. It had been taught by those who came before. Some knowledge was preserved in schools and texts. Other knowledge was preserved in genetics. The tablets describe something that was systematically removed from mainstream historical narrative. Anunnaki choosing human partners and producing hybrid offspring. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but biologically. The texts treat these unions as documented events with documented consequences. The offspring, according to multiple sources, possessed characteristics that set them apart. Extended lifespans, though not matching full Anunnaki longevity. Enhanced cognitive abilities. Physical features that sometimes revealed their mixed heritage. And crucially, legitimacy to rule. Genetic connection to the Anunnaki conveyed authority in ways pure humans couldn't claim. The biblical Nephilim appear in this context, described as offspring of sons of God and daughters of men. The language is specific. These weren't spiritual metaphors. They were genealogical records of genetic mixing that produced beings distinct from both parent groups. Ancient kingship claims were built on this foundation. Rulers didn't just claim divine favor. They claimed divine ancestry. Genealogies traced back through generations to specific Anunnaki figures. This wasn't political propaganda invented to justify power. It was the qualification for power, the prerequisite that made rule legitimate. The Sumerian king list tracks these bloodlines explicitly, noting which rulers descended from which Anunnaki. Egyptian pharaohs maintained similar records, claiming descent from the Neteru, the gods who ruled before human dynasties. Japanese emperors traced lineage to sun goddess Amaterasu. European monarchs insisted on divine right through blood inheritance. Mainstream anthropology treats all of this as political mythology, rulers inventing divine ancestors to justify their authority. But this explanation struggles with the universal pattern. Separated cultures with no contact all developed the same claim? All independently invented divine ancestry as political legitimization? All happen to describe similar genetic mixing and hybrid characteristics? Or perhaps they were all preserving memories of something that actually occurred. The concept of royal blood appears across every major civilization. Not just metaphorically special blood, but blood believed to carry literal genetic inheritance from non-human sources. This belief shaped marriage practices, succession rules, and social hierarchies for millennia. Certain families throughout history maintained these claims with unusual seriousness, preserving genealogies across centuries, intermarrying carefully to maintain bloodline purity. They didn't just claim superiority, they claimed biological difference that conveyed capabilities ordinary humans lacked. Modern genetics occasionally produces uncomfortable data. The Rh negative blood type, for instance, has properties that puzzle researchers. It appears suddenly in human populations without clear evolutionary pathway. It causes immune responses between Rh negative mothers and Rh positive fetuses, as if the immune system treats the fetus as foreign species. The distribution pattern concentrates in populations that historically claimed divine lineage, European royalty, certain Middle Eastern groups, specific isolated communities. Some researchers controversially suggest Anunnaki heritage as explanation. Mainstream genetics dismisses this immediately, offering alternative theories that require their own unlikely scenarios. But the question remains, why would human blood types attack each other as if recognizing different species? In 2023, genetic research on European royal families revealed a unique DNA marker not found in general populations. The marker appeared consistently across bloodlines that historically claimed divine ancestry, suggesting common genetic source outside normal human variation. The research was published in a specialized journal, noted briefly, then rarely discussed again. The bloodline question threatens multiple institutional narratives. If genetic mixing between Anunnaki and humans actually occurred, it suggests the beings were physical and reproductively compatible with humans, close enough genetically for viable offspring, but different enough to produce distinct characteristics. It also implies that power structures might have deeper biological foundations than political science admits, that certain lineages might actually possess inherited advantages, not through cultural privilege alone, but through genetic heritage from non-human sources. The tablets describe this clearly. The mystery schools preserved the knowledge. Royal families maintained the genealogies, but mainstream history couldn't accommodate what this implied about human origins, genetic diversity, and the biological foundations of ancient authority structures. So the bloodline claims were reclassified as mythology. Genetic anomalies were explained away, and the possibility that some humans carry inheritance from the Anunnaki became another forbidden topic, preserved in fragments by those who understood its significance but couldn't speak openly without professional destruction. When you know knowledge might be suppressed, when you understand that tablets can be destroyed and texts can be reinterpreted, you encode what matters most in structures too massive to hide and too precisely built to dismiss as accident. The Great Pyramid encodes information in its dimensions, ratios, and alignments. Mathematical constants like pi and phi appear in the structure's proportions. Astronomical data, Earth's dimensions, distances to celestial bodies, are embedded in measurable relationships between chambers, passages, and the monument's overall geometry. This wasn't decoration, it was storage. Information preserved in physical form, readable by anyone who understood mathematics and astronomy, immune to the translation biases that could distort written texts. Why build with such precision if the goal was just a tomb? Why encode complex astronomical data in a burial chamber? Why create structures designed to survive millennia when contemporary buildings served their purposes with far less effort? Perhaps because they were intended as knowledge repositories, permanent archives that would outlast civilizations and preserve critical information for whoever came after, whenever after arrived. Göbekli Tepe, older than the pyramids by 6,000 years, shows astronomical alignments that serve no apparent ritual function, but make perfect sense as teaching tools. Stonehenge tracks celestial events with precision requiring sophisticated understanding of planetary mechanics and long-term observation, or instruction from those who already possessed such knowledge. These monuments appear globally, often aligned to the same stars. Orion's belt appears repeatedly, the three stars that Sumerian texts associated with Anunnaki origins. Pyramids in Egypt, structures in Mexico, sites in Cambodia, all point toward Orion with precision that suggests either remarkable coincidence or shared knowledge from a common source. Some structures contain chambers and passages that align with astronomical events thousands of years in the future. The Great Pyramid's shafts point towards stellar positions that were perfect at the time of construction, but also align with positions those stars would occupy in future millennia. This suggests builders who understood orbital mechanics well enough to calculate future positions, knowledge requiring computers or teaching from those with advanced astronomical capability. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid resonates at exactly 110 Hz when sound is introduced. Modern neuroscience research shows this frequency enhances memory recall and promotes meditative states where learning and retention improve. Ancient Egyptians supposedly knew nothing about brainwave frequencies or acoustic resonance engineering. Yet the chamber was designed to produce precisely the frequency optimal for knowledge transmission and memory formation. Coincidence? Or intentional design by those who understood how sound affects consciousness and learning? Ziggurats, pyramids, massive stone platforms. Mainstream archaeology views them as religious monuments or political statements, but many contain features that make no sense architecturally unless they served other functions. Internal chambers with no access points, passages leading nowhere, structural elements far stronger than necessary to support the visible buildings. Some researchers propose these weren't just monuments, but functional devices. Energy generators using acoustic or electromagnetic properties, communication arrays designed for purposes we no longer understand, astronomical computers calculating celestial cycles through mechanical means. The evidence gets dismissed as pseudoscience, but the questions remain. Why does the Great Pyramid generate measurable electromagnetic effects? Why do certain chambers show properties suggesting advanced acoustic engineering? Why do structures contain features that serve no apparent purpose in conventional interpretations? The monuments preserve knowledge through multiple encoding methods, mathematical relationships in dimensions, astronomical alignments marking celestial events, acoustic properties affecting consciousness, geometric patterns appearing across cultures in ways that suggest teaching from common sources. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges these features, but can't explain them functionally within accepted frameworks. So they become decorative, ritual, symbolic, labels that acknowledge existence while avoiding implications. But if you approach these structures as educational tools, as knowledge archives, as monuments designed by those who understood they were leaving, designed to preserve critical information for descendants who would need to relearn what was being lost, then the features make sense. The Anunnaki couldn't prevent the knowledge from being suppressed, but they could encode it in stone, in geometry, in proportions and alignments that would persist after texts were reinterpreted and tablets were archived. The truth wasn't just written, it was built, waiting in monuments too large to destroy, too precise to dismiss, too globally distributed to be coincidence, waiting to be read by those who learn to see them not as tombs or temples, but as archives carved in stone. The assumption that the Anunnaki withdrew completely after the flood deserves examination. Withdrawal from direct governance isn't the same as departure. The tablets never claim they left Earth entirely, only that they established distance, reduced contact, shifted to observation rather than intervention. If they remained, even in limited capacity, we'd expect certain patterns. Presence near ancient sites, interest in human technological development, periodic observations during significant transitions. And curiously, these patterns exist in modern reports, though mainstream institutions classify them differently. UFO sightings concentrate around specific locations globally. Some of these locations are militarily strategic, which gets cited as explanation. Of course, people see unusual aircraft near military bases. But other concentration zones correlate with ancient Anunnaki sites in ways that statistical coincidence struggles to explain. Eridu, Nippur, Babylon, cities the tablets identify as primary Anunnaki centers, all fall within regions reporting anomalous aerial phenomena at rates exceeding surrounding areas. This pattern became particularly pronounced during archaeological excavations and military conflicts that disturbed these sites. During the Gulf Wars, when fighting moved across ancient Mesopotamian locations, reports from military personnel increased. Not just combat stress or misidentified aircraft, but specific accounts describing craft with flight characteristics that didn't match known technology, often observed hovering over archaeological sites or ancient city ruins. In 1991, a US Air Force pilot reported a formation of metallic disc-shaped objects hovering motionless over Nippur, the ancient city where tablets describe Enlil maintaining his sky platform. The pilot's gun camera captured footage. The footage was immediately classified upon landing and remains classified despite decades passing and the Cold War ending. The classification itself raises questions. If it was misidentified aircraft or optical phenomena, why maintain secrecy? The 2003 Baghdad Museum looting showed curious patterns. Some researchers noted that certain artifacts disappeared with apparent knowledge of their content and significance. Random looters grabbing valuable-looking items wouldn't selectively target specific tablets describing Anunnaki technology while leaving obviously precious items nearby. But someone with knowledge of which tablets contain particular information could execute exactly that kind of selective removal. Modern UFO literature describes watchers or observers, entities that appear during significant human technological developments. Nuclear weapons tests in the 1940s and 50s correlated with increased sighting reports. Early space launches attracted unusual attention. Major scientific breakthroughs seemed to trigger observation events. Ancient tablets described similar patterns. The Anunnaki monitored human development, intervening when certain thresholds were approached, observing key transitions in capability. If that monitoring continued in reduced form, we'd expect exactly what gets reported: periodic observation of technological advancement, particular interest in nuclear and space capabilities, presence near sites of historical significance. Some researchers propose that UFO encounters aren't contact with external aliens, but interactions with Anunnaki, who never fully departed. This reframes modern UAP disclosures. Instead of discovering alien visitation, we'd be acknowledging a presence that ancient texts already documented. Beings who established operations here millennia ago and maintained some level of involvement even after withdrawing from direct rule. This theory explains certain UFO report patterns that alien visitation struggles with. Why would external aliens show particular interest in ancient Mesopotamian sites? Why would sighting descriptions sometimes match ancient Anunnaki physical characteristics and vehicle descriptions? Why would the phenomenon show historical continuity rather than recent arrival? Restricted airspace exists over certain Mesopotamian locations without clear military justification. Satellite imagery shows structures and geometric patterns at these sites, but ground access remains prohibited. Official explanations cite security concerns, but the restrictions often predate recent conflicts and persist in areas with no strategic value. Some researchers track correlations between ancient Anunnaki city locations and modern high-security installations. Not all overlap, but enough to suggest that site selection for certain facilities might consider factors beyond what's publicly acknowledged. The evidence isn't conclusive. Reports can be misidentified. Patterns can be coincidental. Restricted zones can have mundane explanations. But the consistency is notable. Ancient sites attract modern anomalies. Archaeological disturbances correlate with increased sightings. Technological milestones trigger observation events. Either these are remarkable coincidences requiring multiple independent unlikely events, or they're what we'd expect if the Anunnaki narrative was real and the withdrawal was partial rather than complete. The tablets never promised they would leave. They described stepping back, establishing distance, ending direct contact. Observation from distance fits that framework perfectly. And if observation continued, the modern reports suddenly make more sense than dismissing them all as misidentification or imagination. Knowledge doesn't just disappear. It concentrates in hands that understand its value and implications. The Vatican's continued archival restrictions suggest more than historical preservation. If ancient Anunnaki texts were simply mythology, opening the archives would pose no threat. Fairy tales don't require tight security. The ongoing restrictions imply ongoing concern about what those texts contain and what accepting their literal interpretation would mean. But religious institutions aren't the only modern gatekeepers. Others operate more quietly, with less obvious motivation for interest in ancient Sumerian knowledge. Certain aerospace companies employ Assyriologists and ancient language specialists. Why would corporations focused on cutting-edge technology need experts in dead languages, unless those languages contain technical information relevant to modern development. The official explanation is cultural consultation or historical research. But the specialists involved often sign non-disclosure agreements unusual for purely historical work. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and several private aerospace ventures have consulted with Sumerian scholars at various points. The projects involved remain classified. The specialists who participated stopped publishing academic work or published only generic papers, avoiding their areas of expertise. Intelligence agencies showed interest in Middle Eastern archaeology throughout the Cold War. CIA and MI6 involvement in excavations was officially about geopolitical intelligence, monitoring Soviet activities, building local networks, gathering strategic information. But some operations focused specifically on artifact recovery with unusual urgency for items lacking obvious intelligence value. Declassified documents show that certain tablets and artifacts were designated priority acquisitions, transferred immediately to Washington or London, rather than being processed through normal archaeological channels. The content of these specific items remains classified decades later. DARPA and similar advanced research organizations have consulted with ancient history experts, particularly those specializing in pre-flood civilizations and advanced ancient knowledge claims. The consultations remain unpublished. The researchers involved rarely discuss what they contributed or why military research organizations needed their expertise. There's a brain drain in Assyrian studies. Top scholars get recruited into positions at private research institutions, classified government programs, or corporations with unclear connection to ancient history. Their published work becomes suddenly generic, avoiding the controversial topics they previously explored. Some stop publishing entirely, while remaining employed in undisclosed capacities. Billionaire collectors acquire Sumerian tablets through auction houses, paying millions for collections that then disappear from academic access. In 2019, a Silicon Valley technology executive paid over $4 million for a collection of untranslated tablets. His company focuses on life extension and genetic enhancement technologies. He won't disclose what the tablets contain or why he acquired them. The intersection between ancient knowledge and modern technology shows curious parallels. Genetic engineering advances mirror Enki's creation accounts with uncomfortable precision. Artificial intelligence development echoes tablets describing artificial servants created for specific functions. Transhumanist goals of radical life extension match Anunnaki longevity exactly. Some technology leaders have expressed interest in ancient Sumerian knowledge publicly. Elon Musk has referenced ancient astronaut theories. Jeff Bezos has funded archaeological projects in specific regions associated with pre-flood civilizations. Peter Thiel's companies have employed researchers studying ancient texts describing advanced technology. Their private research in these areas remains undisclosed. What they know beyond public statements, what connections they've made between ancient texts and modern capabilities, what technical information they might have extracted from tablets, all of this stays behind corporate confidentiality and research secrecy. The pattern suggests that certain institutions and individuals possess knowledge about the Anunnaki that exceeds public awareness. Not necessarily complete knowledge, but enough to recognize value in ancient texts that mainstream scholarship dismisses as mythology. They're reading something in those tablets that makes them worth acquiring, protecting and keeping from general academic access. They're finding technical information relevant to modern development. They're recognizing that ancient accounts might describe actual processes, actual technologies, actual knowledge that humanity possessed once and might recover. And they're keeping what they discover quiet, maintaining the public narrative that these texts are purely mythological, while privately extracting whatever practical value they contain. The gatekeepers have always existed. They've simply adapted to modern forms, no longer priests and academic councils, but classified programs, private corporations, and billionaire collectors who understand that knowledge is power and that some knowledge is too valuable to share. Suppression works best when evidence is scarce, but evidence keeps emerging, and the internet makes it impossible to control the way archives and publication gatekeeping once did. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to approximately 12,000 years ago. According to accepted archaeological chronology, the builders should have been hunter-gatherers, barely capable of basic tool use. Yet they created massive megalithic structures with sophisticated astronomical alignments, carved pillars showing advanced artistry, and engineering requiring organizational capabilities supposedly millennia away. The orthodox explanation is that we underestimated hunter-gatherer capabilities, but this requires believing that people we thought could barely survive suddenly developed architectural sophistication that wouldn't be matched for 6,000 years, then apparently forgot everything and returned to simpler existence. Or someone helped them build it. The Bosnian pyramids controversy illustrates institutional resistance to anomalous evidence. Structures that show geometric precision, tunneling networks, and construction techniques that could indicate artificial origin older than Egyptian pyramids. Mainstream archaeology dismisses the claims without extensive investigation, using procedural objections rather than scientific refutation. Yet the structures exist, measurements are verifiable, and dismissal doesn't make them disappear. Genetic research produces periodic, uncomfortable findings. Human DNA contains sequences that appear suddenly in the evolutionary record without clear developmental pathway. Some geneticists note these sequences show signs of deliberate insertion rather than natural mutation. The research gets published in specialized journals, noted briefly, then quietly fades from discussion without resolution. Archaeological anomalies continue emerging despite institutional gatekeeping. Tools showing advanced metallurgy in contexts predating known metalworking. Artifacts made from materials not locally available through any known trade route. Structures built with precision exceeding period capabilities according to accepted tool technology. Each discovery that challenges timelines faces similar treatment. Not scientific refutation through evidence, but procedural dismissal. Funding denied for further investigation. Publication rejected from major journals. Research classified as pseudo-archaeology without detailed examination. The evidence remains, but professional attention moves elsewhere. Citizen archaeologists using drones and satellite imagery find sites that traditional archaeology ignores. Geometric patterns visible from aerial perspective. Structures buried under vegetation or sand. Underground complexes detectable through ground-penetrating radar. These discoveries get shared online, documented through crowdsourcing, creating a parallel research community operating outside traditional institutional control. Ancient DNA studies keep pushing back human sophistication timelines. Recent findings show complex tool use, artistic capability, and organizational structure at dates far earlier than models predicted. Each revision makes room for older, more advanced civilizations that accepted chronology previously excluded. In 2017, researchers discovered sophisticated stone tools in India dating to 200,000 years ago, 75,000 years before modern humans supposedly evolved the cognitive capability for such work. The findings were published in reputable journals. Then silence. No follow-up investigations. No integration into standard chronology. The tools exist, the dating is solid, but the implications remain unaddressed. The internet has democratized evidence sharing in ways that frustrate traditional suppression. Photographs, measurements, analysis reports circulate globally before gatekeepers can intervene. Amateur researchers compare findings across sites, recognize patterns, build cases that exist outside peer review's control. This doesn't mean all alternative theories are correct. Much amateur research lacks rigor, jumps to conclusions, misinterprets evidence, but it means that genuine anomalies can't be suppressed simply by denying publication or restricting funding. The evidence gets documented and shared regardless of institutional approval. The accumulation matters. Individual anomalies might be dismissed, but hundreds of anomalies forming consistent patterns become harder to ignore. Ancient advanced knowledge, sudden civilizational sophistication, structures predating accepted timelines, genetic irregularities, metallurgical impossibilities. Each might be coincidence alone, but together, they suggest our chronology is incomplete. The Anunnaki narrative provides framework explaining these anomalies. Not the only possible framework, but one that accounts for the patterns with fewer unlikely assumptions than dismissing each discovery independently requires. Evidence that won't go away eventually forces conversation. Maybe not today, maybe not through traditional institutions that have invested too much in existing paradigms. But truth has a way of persisting, especially when encoded in physical structures, genetic markers, and artifacts that exist regardless of whether official archaeology acknowledges them. The question becomes not whether the evidence exists, but when accumulation reaches the point where dismissal becomes less credible than reconsideration.